Evan Brooks had never considered himself the kind of man who sought attention, but the house he purchased on the hillside overlooking the valley seemed to draw notice all on its own. It was an odd structure, a remnant of the 1960s with its flat roof and angular design, something that most potential buyers had dismissed as impractical or outdated. But to Evan, who had spent his career as an architect reshaping lifeless shells into vibrant spaces, the building was an opportunity. He poured months of his savings and even more of his energy into transforming it. The interior was stripped down to concrete and steel, then carefully rebuilt with clean lines, warm woods, and tall windows that blurred the line between inside and outside. The roof, however, was his true masterpiece. What had once been a neglected slab of tar and gravel, he turned into a wide terrace lined with greenery, a garden in the sky. He imagined long summer evenings up there, surrounded by vines climbing trellises, herbs growing in pots, and lanterns flickering as the sun slipped behind the ridge. It was not just an aesthetic project, but a sanctuary, a place where he could retreat after days of client demands, design revisions, and the relentless chatter of urban life. For a time, the dream seemed intact. Evan spent weekends adjusting irrigation lines for the planters, sanding the wooden decking boards by hand, and arranging seating areas that struck the perfect balance between comfort and geometry. The neighbors, while polite, were distant, the sort of suburban residents who nodded as they passed but rarely offered more than a fleeting greeting. He did not mind. He valued his independence and believed that privacy was part of the unspoken contract of the neighborhood. The air was clear up on the hillside, and on quiet nights the only sound was the chirping of insects and the low rustle of wind through the pines. That illusion shattered on a bright spring morning. Evan was inside preparing coffee when the sound reached him, an unmistakable thrum, deep and mechanical, the kind of vibration that rattled window panes and pressed against the chest. At first, he thought it must be construction work farther down the road, but the noise grew louder, closer, until the entire house seemed to vibrate with it. He rushed out onto the deck just in time to see a helicopter descending, its rotor wash flattening the treetops, the downdraft scattering soil from the planters and snapping the stems of his carefully nurtured herbs. The machine touched down not on a landing pad or open field, but directly on his roof terrace, its skids crushing the edge of the wooden deck with the weight of casual disregard. Evan stood frozen, half in disbelief, half in rage, as the pilot powered down the engine. A tall man stepped out, moving with the ease of someone accustomed to commanding attention without needing to speak. He wore aviator glasses, a leather jacket despite the heat, and carried himself with the rigid confidence of someone who had long ago stopped asking permission. When he noticed Evan standing at the doorway, the man raised a hand in a gesture that was meant to appear friendly but felt more like a claim of possession. "Convenient spot you got here," he called out over the fading roar of the blades. "I've been needing a place nearby to put her down." There was no introduction, no apology, no acknowledgement of intrusion. Evan's first words caught in his throat, overwhelmed by the absurdity of the scene. This was his home, his private terrace, and yet it was being treated as if it were an unmarked clearing in the woods, open for anyone bold enough to land. The man, later introducing himself as Lawrence Matthews, spoke casually about the flight, about the prevailing winds and the difficulty of finding a suitable flat surface in the area, as though the explanation itself should suffice as justification. Evan struggled to interrupt, finally managing to demand an explanation, but Lawrence only shrugged, as if it were self-evident. "I used to land here with the previous owner. She never had a problem. Figured you wouldn't either." The words struck Evan harder than the rotor wash. He had bought the property through all the proper legal channels, inspected the title history, reviewed the deed with meticulous care, and nowhere had there been mention of a landing agreement or aviation easement. The notion that someone could simply drop out of the sky and claim usage rights on his rooftop felt both absurd and menacing. He tried to assert himself, telling Lawrence in no uncertain terms that this was private property and not an airfield, but the man only smiled, a thin, confident expression that carried the weight of experience. "Paperwork says otherwise," Lawrence remarked, tapping the pocket of his jacket before climbing back into the cockpit. Moments later, the blades thundered to life again, and the helicopter lifted off, scattering leaves and sending a shudder through the frame of the house as it rose into the sky and vanished over the ridge. When the noise finally faded, Evan stood on the terrace surveying the damage. Soil scattered across the boards, planter boxes tipped over, one section of railing splintered beneath the weight of the skid. His sanctuary had been violated in the most literal sense, and yet he had no idea where to begin in defending it. Neighbors looked up briefly from their yards, some shading their eyes against the sun, but no one approached or asked questions. To them, perhaps, the sight of Lawrence's helicopter was nothing new. To Evan, however, it was the first note of what would soon become a relentless discord. The morning after the helicopter's first landing, Evan woke to an unease that clung to him more persistently than the echo of the blades. He tried to convince himself it had been a one-time intrusion, some bizarre misunderstanding, something that would resolve itself without further confrontation. But as he stepped onto the terrace, he saw the evidence etched into the wood. Deep. Impressions from the skids, scuffed decking where the helicopter had pivoted, and streaks of hydraulic fluid staining the grain. His sanctuary, carefully built with months of effort, had been reduced to a functional landing strip without his consent. The sight filled him with a simmering anger, but beneath the anger was fear, the kind of fear that arises when you realize your private boundaries mean little to those willing to ignore them. Later that day, he went downtown to the municipal records office. The clerk, a middle-aged woman who had clearly repeated the same instructions 1,000 times, took his request without surprise. But when Evan asked whether the property held any recorded easements or special usage rights, she hesitated, then frowned as the computer pulled up the file. "There's an addendum here," she said, scrolling through the screen. "Something about temporary air access registered in 1987. She turned the monitor slightly, and Evan saw a scanned page with a shaky signature, a typed note, referencing the property and a stamp from the county. His chest tightened. He had reviewed every page of his deed before purchase, but this document had never appeared in the packet provided by the title company. He asked for a copy, and the clerk obliged, though she gave him a cautious look, as though she understood the weight of what she was handing over. That evening he spread the papers across his dining table, comparing the addendum with his own purchase records. The formatting was subtly different, the ink lighter than other documents of that era, the language vague enough to be interpreted in multiple ways. It mentioned emergency aviation access to rooftop or flat surface areas as deemed appropriate by the holder of rights, but never specified who the holder was or under what conditions the right expired. He flipped through his closing documents again and again, searching for any reference to it, but the addendum was absent. He felt his throat constrict as he considered the possibility that someone had deliberately withheld it during the sale. Unable to sleep, Evan called the real estate attorney who had handled his closing. The attorney, polite but distant, reviewed the scanned document Evan sent by email and admitted it looked suspicious, though technically valid in form. "If this was filed retroactively or tampered with," the attorney explained, "proving it will be difficult. County records are presumed correct unless you can show otherwise, and any challenge would be slow, expensive, and uncertain." Evan pressed him, desperate for clarity, but the man's tone remained cool, almost resigned. "If your neighbor claims rights under this document, you may be facing a long battle. You should prepare for the possibility that he knew about this before you did." The words rang in Evan's ears long after the call ended. He walked through the house restless, opening windows, pacing the terrace, trying to breathe away the claustrophobic sense that the ground, or rather the roof, beneath him was not secure. At one point, near midnight, he heard the low hum of rotor blades in the distance, faint but unmistakable. He froze, staring into the dark sky above the ridge, and though the sound faded without approach, he remained standing there until the stars blurred from the strain in his eyes. The following morning brought no relief. As he drove out of his driveway, he noticed an envelope tucked under the windshield wiper. The paper was thick, embossed with the name of a local legal firm. Inside was a short letter written with clinical detachment. This correspondence serves as notice that Mr. Lawrence Matthews asserts rights of aerial access to the property located at 178 Ridgeview Drive, pursuant to County Filing Number A8745. Any attempt to restrict or interfere with such access may result in immediate legal remedy. Evan gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened, reading the letter again and again at red lights, his pulse hammering. It was not just bravado from a neighbor. It was the opening shot of a campaign to legitimize an intrusion. When he confronted Lawrence that evening, the man was standing outside his own modern steel and glass house 2 lots over, speaking casually into a phone. He ended the call with deliberate slowness as Evan approached. The exchange that followed played out like a scene Lawrence had rehearsed. He pulled from his jacket a folded copy of the same addendum Evan had obtained, waved it with a smirk, and declared, "Precedent, Brooks." Legal precedent. This property's been open to air access longer than you've owned it. I'm just exercising what's already there. His calm tone, the infuriating confidence, and the way he leaned slightly closer as he spoke made it clear. He wasn't asking. He was daring Evan to resist. Evan tried to argue, insisting the document was fraudulent or at least outdated, but Lawrence only shook his head. "You can fight the county, fight the archive, fight me in court if you've got the time and money. Or you can accept that some things were decided long before you arrived." Then, without waiting for a response, he walked away, leaving Evan standing in the twilight with the awful recognition that he was outmatched not by brute force, but by a man's mastery of bureaucracy. That night, Evan sat at his desk surrounded by copies of deeds, maps, architectural surveys, anything he could find that might prove the falsity of the addendum. He cross-checked signatures, compared typefaces, noted inconsistencies, but the more he examined them, the less confident he felt. A forged record inserted into official channels gained legitimacy simply by existing, and unless he uncovered the origin, he would be dismissed as paranoid or mistaken. The phone call from his attorney echoed in his mind. Slow, expensive, uncertain. At 3 a.m, he went upstairs to the terrace, desperate for calm, but instead of peace he found tire marks, faint but new, near the railing where the skids had touched down again. Lawrence had returned under the cover of night, and Evan had not even heard it over the white noise of the city below. His sanctuary was no longer his own, and the realization struck him with an almost physical force. The fight had already begun, and he was not sure whether the battleground was paper, sky, or the fragile line between them. Evan tried to cling to the hope that the situation might be resolved through persistence and proper channels, but that illusion collapsed almost immediately when he attempted to escalate his concerns with the county. He spent half a day moving from one counter to another in the government building, clutching copies of his deed and the suspicious addendum, explaining in careful, logical terms that the document must have been altered or fabricated. Each official he spoke to gave him the same cautious smile, the same practiced explanation that county records were presumed valid, and that any challenges would need to be pursued through a lengthy civil process. One clerk, younger than the rest, leaned in slightly when handing back the forms and whispered, "You're not the first one. Be careful how far you push it." That comment, far more than the bureaucratic indifference, unsettled him. It meant there were others, and that the system was designed not to protect property owners but to exhaust them into surrender. When he returned home, the sound of rotor blades greeted him before he even pulled into his driveway. He looked up and saw the helicopter circling above his house with a kind of deliberate arrogance, as though it were patrolling territory already claimed. By the time he climbed the steps to his terrace, the machine had touched down again, and Lawrence was stepping out with a duffel bag slung casually over one shoulder. The downdraft scattered more soil, bent the railings further, and drove grit into Evan's eyes. He shouted over the noise, demanding that Lawrence leave, but the man only laughed, adjusted his sunglasses, and strode across the terrace as if he owned it. "Don't take it personally," he said once the engine idled. "You should think of this as a partnership. You keep the place clean, I handle the landings. Works for both of us." Evan's response was less controlled than he intended. He lunged forward, grabbing the duffel and throwing it back toward the skids, shouting that the property was his and that he would call the police. For a moment, Lawrence's expression hardened, the easy confidence replaced by something colder, a reminder of the man's military background. Then he smiled again, almost pityingly. "Call them. They'll tell you it's a civil matter. I'll be gone before they arrive, and I'll be back before you can file the next complaint. You don't understand, Brooks. Paperwork is stronger than outrage." True to his word, when the officers arrived nearly an hour later, the helicopter was gone, leaving only the battered terrace as evidence. The officers listened politely, took notes, and promised to document the incident. But their tone carried the same weary detachment Evan had already encountered at the county office. One of them even glanced toward Lawrence's property, then back at Evan with an expression that suggested he wanted to say more but thought better of it. The message was clear. Lawrence was untouchable, at least through conventional means. Over the next week, the intrusions multiplied. The helicopter appeared at odd hours, sometimes landing in the early evening just as Evan sat down to dinner, sometimes rattling the windows past midnight. Once he returned home to find the machine already parked on his terrace, its skids crushing a planter and the faint smell of aviation fuel lingering in the air. Another time he discovered the door to the stairwell leading up from the second floor had been left ajar, though he was certain he had locked it. Lawrence insisted he had not entered the house, but the implication alone, that he could if he wished, was enough to erode Evan's sense of safety inside his own walls. He began documenting everything. Not with the performative flourish of someone seeking media attention, but with the desperation of a man who knew his word alone would not withstand scrutiny. He photographed the damage, logged the dates and times, and even noted the patterns of flight overhead, trying to piece together a record that could not be ignored. Yet, the more evidence he gathered, the less secure he felt. Each new landing reminded him that his sanctuary was accessible not just to one man, but to anyone bold enough to exploit the loophole. The roof that had once symbolized control and creativity now symbolized vulnerability. One evening, exhausted by the constant noise and tension, he drove out to clear his head and found himself at the edge of the old municipal airfield. There, beyond the chain-link fence, rows of neglected hangars stretched into the distance, relics of a bygone era. He watched as a group of mechanics worked on a small fire department helicopter, and in that moment an idea struck him. Not a plan, but the faint outline of one. If Lawrence could bend the system to his advantage, perhaps Evan could find a way to bend it back. Not through force or confrontation, which he would lose, but by reclaiming legitimacy from the same structures Lawrence had corrupted. When he returned home that night, however, his fragile resolve was tested again. On the terrace, under the pale wash of moonlight, sat a fresh set of tire marks and a scrap of metal plating torn from the helicopter's landing gear. It was deliberate, left behind like a calling card. He bent to pick it up, and for the first time he noticed etched numbers along the edge, a military serial code. Holding the fragment in his hand, Evan realized the fight was no longer simply about property lines or private rights. It was about exposure, leverage, and the unsettling possibility that Lawrence's connections ran deeper than anyone around him suspected. The first escalation was not a single event, but a relentless sequence. Each intrusion louder, bolder, more destructive, eroding both the structure of his house and the certainty of his reality. By the time the week ended, Evan no longer believed he could preserve his sanctuary through patience. The battle for his roof had become a battle for control of his life, and Lawrence had made it clear he intended to win it. Evan had reached the point where anger no longer came in bursts but had settled into his body like a slow-burning fever, altering the way he looked at every corner of his home. The terrace that once filled him with pride now seemed foreign, as though someone had placed a scar across its surface that could never be removed. The city's bureaucratic silence and the police officers' detached indifference had taught him a grim lesson. If he wanted to protect his house, he would need to stop appealing to institutions that were either compromised or apathetic, and instead search for a leverage point of his own, something capable of shifting the balance in his favor. For days he carried the fragment of the helicopter landing plate in his pocket, running his thumb across the serial numbers whenever the distant drone of blades haunted him. Those digits were more than scratches on metal. They were proof that Lawrence's machine had a history, a trail of ownership, and perhaps a vulnerability. Driven by the need for clarity, Evan returned to the old municipal airfield where the fire department kept its equipment. He had noticed on his previous visit the way the mechanics worked methodically, unhurried yet attentive, as if their loyalty was not to paperwork but to the integrity of the machines themselves. Standing outside the fence, he studied them for a long time before gathering the courage to approach the gate. A man in grease-stained coveralls met him there, suspicious at first, until Evan explained that he was an architect living nearby and that he had questions about a helicopter frequently flying over his property. When Evan produced the fragment of landing gear, the man's demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly. He turned the piece over in his hand, squinting at the etched numbers, then looked back at Evan with a trace of recognition in his eyes. "This came off a military bird," he said quietly, "one that shouldn't be in private hands anymore." He didn't elaborate, but he slipped the fragment into Evan's palm again and added, "Be careful who you're dealing with. Some aircraft are ghosts, officially retired but still circling where they shouldn't." The cryptic warning lingered with Evan as he drove home, and he began to piece together a new picture of his neighbor. Lawrence wasn't just arrogant or entitled. He was a man who thrived in gray zones, someone who had built a life on exploiting ambiguities where oversight failed. If his helicopter was indeed a ghost, its very presence on Evan's roof was not only intrusive but illegal, and that illegality might be the crack in the armor Evan needed. He spent nights digging through public databases, combing aviation forums, and even reaching out anonymously to a pilots' association online. Each clue deepened the mystery. The serial number was linked to a model officially decommissioned a decade earlier, and its last recorded assignment had been with a National Guard unit on the other side of the country. How Lawrence had come to possess it was a question left unanswered, but the implication was clear. His neighbor's confidence was built on the assumption that no one would dare to question the legitimacy of a man who claimed both military service and bureaucratic paperwork as shields. One evening, armed with this knowledge but uncertain of how to wield it, Evan drove to the county building again, not to file a complaint but to request flight path data under the guise of noise abatement research. The clerk was reluctant, but after Evan persisted and filled out forms with the stubborn patience of someone willing to sit all night, she handed him a thin packet of radar records. Most of it was routine. Sightings of small planes, weather balloons, commercial flights, but woven through the data were irregular notations. A rotorcraft with no tail number filed, appearing intermittently above his neighborhood, recorded but never investigated. The absence of scrutiny was almost as damning as the activity itself. He realized then that he did not need to prove ownership of the sky above his home. He only needed to show that the man using it was violating every standard of aviation safety. The breakthrough came not from law or property records but from a chance encounter 2 days later. As Evan left a hardware store, weighed down with lumber to repair yet another section of his terrace railing, he saw a county fire marshal's vehicle parked outside. The marshal, a tall woman with weathered skin and an air of weary pragmatism, was speaking with a clerk. Evan hesitated, then approached, introducing himself and explaining the situation in careful detail. At first, she regarded him with skepticism, but when he mentioned the fragment of landing gear and the unregistered flight path records, her expression hardened into something closer to concern. "If what you're saying is true," she murmured, "that's not just a nuisance, it's a hazard. We've got wildfire zones out here. Unauthorized landings could jeopardize evacuation routes." She asked him to bring the evidence to her office, promising no outcome but at least an attentive ear. For the first time in weeks, Evan felt a faint thread of hope. He returned home and gathered everything: the photographs of damage, the suspicious addendum, the radar data, the fragment with its serial number. He placed them neatly into a folder, not as a desperate collection of grievances, but as the beginnings of a case. That night he slept lightly, yet without the suffocating dread that had haunted him before. He had found, if not an ally, at least someone who recognized the seriousness of what was happening. But hope was fragile, and Lawrence seemed to sense it. The very next evening, the helicopter returned, descending with a roar more violent than ever. This time, Lawrence did not step out immediately. He let the machine sit idling on the terrace, its blades screaming in defiance until neighbors gathered in their yards to watch. Then he emerged, strolling across the roof as if hosting a performance, and called down to Evan, who stood rigid in the doorway. "Still fighting, Brooks? You should learn to pick your battles. The sky doesn't belong to you." The words, amplified by the thrum of rotors, carried across the hillside, and though Evan's neighbors did not intervene, he could see their discomfort in the way they shifted, whispered, and avoided his eyes. Lawrence wasn't just pressing him, he was making the conflict public, framing Evan as the unreasonable party who refused to accept what had always been. Yet what Lawrence did not realize was that this spectacle, intended to humiliate, only strengthened Evan's resolve. Because among those watching was the fire marshal, who had driven by on an unrelated inspection and stopped at the sight of the circling helicopter. She stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, expression unreadable, but Evan caught the subtle nod she gave when their eyes met. It was not a promise of victory, but it was recognition, and recognition was enough. The midpoint had arrived. Evan was no longer a solitary homeowner railing against indifference. He was a man who had discovered the crack in his neighbor's armor, and though the path ahead was fraught with risk, he finally believed there might be a way to turn intrusion into exposure. The balance of power had shifted, not in dramatic triumph, but in the quiet, undeniable weight of evidence beginning to stack against the intruder. For the first time since the helicopter descended, Evan felt that his sanctuary might not be lost forever, that the sky above his roof might yet belong to him again, not through force, but through truth revealed. The quiet flicker of hope Evan felt after the fire marshal's recognition did not last long. Lawrence, as though he had sensed the slightest shift in momentum, responded with an escalation so calculated and aggressive that Evan realized his neighbor was not merely defending a personal convenience, but guarding something much larger, something he was willing to protect with every weapon at his disposal. Within a week of Evan submitting his folder of evidence to the marshal's office, a letter arrived by certified mail, this one more elaborate than the previous notices. It came from a law firm downtown, written in sterile, almost surgical prose, alleging that Evan had engaged in interference with federally protected aviation access, citing obscure sections of municipal codes twisted into claims that his terrace fell under pre-designated emergency infrastructure. The document threatened immediate legal action unless Evan signed a stipulation acknowledging limited use of his roof by Lawrence and indemnifying him against any claims of damage. Reading the letter under the kitchen light, Evan felt his pulse race with a mix of anger and despair. The very idea that his sanctuary could be reframed as infrastructure was not only absurd, but terrifying in its plausibility. He thought of the clerk at the county office, whispering that he wasn't the first, and realized this was how it worked. A steady layering of fabricated legitimacy until resistance seemed not just futile, but dangerous. Yet, as much as the letter rattled him, he did not sign. Instead, he drove straight to the fire marshal's office the next morning and placed the envelope on her desk. She scanned it quickly, her expression tightening as she recognized the manipulation. "They're pushing you," she said, "to see if you'll fold. But this kind of overreach doesn't stay hidden forever." She didn't promise protection, but the fact that she kept the letter suggested she intended to use it. Lawrence's tactics, however, were not limited to paperwork. The helicopter landings grew even more brazen. One evening, Evan returned from the grocery store to find the machine squatting on his roof, its rotors silent, the fading sun glinting off its dark windows. There was no sign of Lawrence himself, just the hulking aircraft parked as though it had every right to be there. Evan stood in his driveway staring at it, feeling the weight of the neighbors' eyes as curtains shifted in nearby houses. The message was unmistakable. The roof was not his to protect, not anymore, and Lawrence could occupy it without even being present. When he finally climbed the stairs to confront the intrusion, he found a note tucked beneath one of the skids, scrawled in bold strokes across a torn map. Partnership or conflict? Choose wisely. The psychological pressure began to erode the edges of Evan's resolve. He found himself waking at night to phantom vibrations, rushing to the terrace only to discover the sky empty. He began locking every window, checking the stairwell door twice, then 3 times before bed. He stopped inviting friends over, embarrassed by the damage, the noise, and the sense that he could no longer guarantee their safety. Yet his isolation only seemed to embolden Lawrence, who began weaving his narrative into the neighborhood itself. At a community council meeting Evan attended in hopes of rallying support, he discovered Lawrence already there, standing confidently at the front of the room, explaining to the attendees that his flights were part of a long-standing emergency plan to ensure rapid evacuation in case of fire or disaster. He invoked his military service, his supposed coordination with county officials, and framed himself as a guardian of the hillside. To Evan's horror, several neighbors nodded along, murmuring approval at the idea of having an extra safety measure nearby. The rage that burned in Evan's chest during that meeting nearly drove him to stand up and shout, but he restrained himself, realizing that Lawrence had laid the trap precisely for that reaction. If Evan appeared irrational or hostile, it would only reinforce Lawrence's story that he was the one obstructing community safety. Instead, he sat silently, fists clenched under the table while his neighbor rewrote the narrative in real time. When the meeting ended, Lawrence caught his eye, offered a slow, mocking smile, and whispered as he passed, "You're already losing." But what Lawrence did not anticipate was that Evan had already begun to document not just the landings, but the lies. He had recordings of the damage, evidence of the unregistered helicopter, and now, through the fire marshal, an official interest in his case. Still, Lawrence's escalation made one thing brutally clear. This was no longer about one man protecting his home. It was about exposure, about pulling a thread that could unravel a larger fabric of corruption. The forged documents, the unregistered flights, the manipulation of municipal codes, all of it suggested a network of influence designed to normalize what should have been intolerable. The second escalation was not simply louder or more destructive, it was a shift from private violation to public theater, from intimidation by noise and intrusion to the strategic shaping of perception. Lawrence had tried to turn the neighborhood into his audience, the council into his stage, and Evan into the antagonist of a story he was carefully crafting. Yet, as Evan walked back to his car that night, his ears still ringing from the hollow applause, he knew that Lawrence's arrogance was also his weakness. In overreaching, in making the conflict visible, he had created opportunities for scrutiny. And scrutiny, Evan realized, was the one force Lawrence could not afford. The battle was no longer about whether a helicopter could land on a roof. It was about whether one man's carefully constructed illusion of authority could withstand the slow, relentless pressure of truth. And, as exhausted as he was, Evan understood that he could not retreat now. To yield would be to surrender not just his home, but the principle that private life could be rewritten by those brazen enough to manufacture legitimacy. The second escalation had set the stakes higher than ever, and for the first time Evan felt not only that he was fighting for himself, but that others, watching from behind their curtains, might eventually depend on whether he won. The culmination came with a swiftness that Evan could not have predicted, though in hindsight he realized every step had been leading toward that confrontation. The fire marshal had quietly gathered her own records, pairing Evan's evidence with official reports of unregistered flight activity, and when she finally notified him that the case had been referred to a higher authority, he felt both relief and dread. For weeks he had lived with the uncertainty of whether anyone would ever take his claims seriously, and now that the system was stirring at last, he feared the backlash more than the silence. His fears proved justified when Lawrence responded not with retreat, but with an audacious lawsuit, filed in county court, demanding formal recognition of his alleged rights to use the roof as a designated landing zone and accusing Evan of harassment and interference. Reading the complaint, Evan felt the ground tilt beneath him. The man who had violated his sanctuary was now casting himself as the victim, and the courthouse would be the arena where truth and fabrication collided. The trial was set with unnerving speed, and from the moment Evan entered the courtroom, he sensed the weight of the struggle pressing on him. Lawrence arrived, flanked by two attorneys, immaculate in their suits, projecting the calm superiority of professionals who had played this game countless times. Lawrence himself carried the same expression he had worn the first day the helicopter landed, relaxed, confident, faintly amused, as though he were watching a play he had already written. Evan, by contrast, sat alone at the defendant's table until the fire marshal entered and took her seat behind him, a silent declaration that he was not entirely without allies. The judge, a gray-haired man with a reputation for impatience, called the proceedings to order, and the clash began. Lawrence's attorneys opened with polished rhetoric, presenting the addendum from 1987 as though it were unassailable fact, a legally binding document that granted their client rights long before Evan had purchased the property. They spoke of community safety, of tradition, of a supposed understanding with previous owners, weaving a narrative in which Lawrence was not a trespasser but a guardian unfairly maligned by an uncooperative neighbor. Evan listened, fists clenched under the table as his home was described as a resource for the greater good, his objections framed as selfish obstruction. When it was his turn to speak, his voice wavered at first, but steadied as he laid out the story in painstaking detail, from the first unexpected landing to the evidence of unregistered flights, to the fragment of landing gear bearing serial numbers. From a decommissioned military aircraft, he presented the radar data, the photographs, the letters threatening him with legal consequences, and for the first time he felt the weight of his preparation transform into strength rather than desperation. The turning point came when the fire marshal testified. With measured authority, she explained how unauthorized landings endangered evacuation routes, how falsified or outdated documents undermined emergency planning, and how her office had verified that Lawrence's helicopter did not appear in any legal registry of active civilian aircraft. She held up the fragment of landing gear and read aloud the code etched into its surface, identifying it as belonging to equipment struck from inventory years ago. The silence in the courtroom was palpable, and for the first time Lawrence's confidence faltered, his jaw tightening as though he had not anticipated that particular piece of evidence surviving his intimidation. His attorneys attempted to dismiss the findings as irrelevant, arguing that the technical status of the helicopter did not affect the validity of his rights, but the judge's expression grew colder with each repetition of that claim. When Evan was allowed a final statement, he did not appeal to law or precedent but to the principle of ownership, explaining that he had invested his life into restoring a home and creating a sanctuary, only to have it invaded and repurposed by a man, wielding fabricated legitimacy. If a false document can erase private boundaries, he concluded, then none of us in this county truly own our homes." The words hung in the air, simple yet undeniable, and in that moment Evan felt the judge listening not as an arbiter of each technicalities, but as a man who understood what was at stake. The decision, when it came, was delivered with stern clarity. The court declared the addendum invalid, citing inconsistencies in its filing and the absence of corroborating records, and ruled that Lawrence had no rights whatsoever to Evan's property. Moreover, the evidence of unregistered flight activity and the questionable origin of the helicopter were referred to federal authorities for investigation. Lawrence's lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, and the court ordered him to cease all landings immediately under penalty of contempt. As the gavel struck, a wave of exhaustion swept over Evan, but beneath it surged a fierce, quiet triumph. For months he had been the intruded, the harassed, the one dismissed by officials and mocked by his neighbor. Yet in the end it was Lawrence who left the courtroom surrounded not by admiration, but by whispers, his posture stiff, his eyes refusing to meet those around him. For Evan, the climax was not a moment of celebration, but of release, the unraveling of a tension that had constricted every part of his life. The battle for his roof had ended in law rather than violence, and though the scars on his terrace remained, the deeper scar, the sense that he was powerless in his own home, began to fade. The illusion of invulnerability Lawrence had projected was shattered, and Evan, for the first time since the thunder of blades filled his sky, felt the air above his sanctuary return to silence. When the trial ended and the court's order had been entered into record, Evan returned to his hillside home with a sense of disbelief that bordered on disorientation. For so long the fight had consumed him, his thoughts revolving endlessly around noise, damage, and the next looming confrontation, that silence itself felt foreign, almost fragile, as though the air might shatter at any moment with the pounding blades of another intrusion. Yet days passed, then weeks, and the sky above his terrace remained clear, the stillness broken only by the usual hum of traffic in the valley and the cries of birds circling overhead. Lawrence's house down the street grew quieter as well, its driveway empty more often than not, until one morning a moving truck appeared, and by nightfall the lights inside had gone dark for good. The absence of his neighbor did not erase the scars entirely. Sections of the terrace railing still bore splinters from the skids, and gouges marked the decking where soil and fuel had spilled, but those marks became reminders rather than wounds. He repaired the planters, sanded the boards, and allowed the vines to climb again over the trellises, reclaiming what had been threatened. Neighbors who had once avoided his gaze now stopped to speak, tentative at first, then with growing warmth, admitting that they had watched the struggle unfold in silence out of fear of becoming entangled themselves. A few apologized, others offered to help with repairs, and though Evan harbored no illusions that their support would have come without the court's ruling, he accepted it as part of the slow process of restoring community as well as property. On the first evening, he allowed himself to sit alone on the terrace without tension. He lit a lantern, poured a glass of wine, and listened to the quiet as if it were a gift. The sanctuary he had built was not just restored, but transformed. No longer a fragile dream vulnerable to intrusion, but a hard-won reality secured by perseverance. He knew that elsewhere battles like his would continue, that men like Lawrence thrived on exploiting loopholes and manufacturing legitimacy, but he also knew that their power was not absolute, that a single determined refusal to yield could unravel even the most confident illusion. As the sun dipped behind the ridge and the valley fell into shadow, Evan leaned back in his chair, the night air cool against his skin, and felt, for the first time in months, not just safe, but truly at home.